Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 9 on climate change and geoengineering. This will be the last case study that I present before your own independent research projects in Lesson 10 and 11. If you haven't selected your topic for your research project, you should probably do that now. You're going to have to do some library research. All the information for those research projects should be up on Canvas at canvas.njit.edu. All right, let's jump into this presentation. So my goal here is to talk about the ethics of geoengineering. And I think in order to do that, it helps to have a little bit of context, first about the current situation in the science of climate change. And then also, I also want to talk about the history of temperature change on planet Earth, sort of the geoscience and climate science history. In order to get some perspective on the situation that we currently face, I think you all probably know that climate change is happening and things are getting hot and it's going to be pretty dramatic. I'm sure you've been told this for your entire educational lives. Your teachers have been preparing you for this because it really is going to be one of the most important issues, both politically and technically, that you and your generation and your children's generation will have to face. And so we're trying to prepare you for that future, because it's not going to be very pretty. My goal in this lesson is not really to convince you that climate change is real, although I'll say some stuff about that also. But I really want to lay out the facts that are necessary to consider the ethical challenges of geoengineering. It's a very hard topic. The ethics are very hard, and I think you need the proper scientific background to approach it. So in order to help with this, your textbook talks a little bit about not just environmental ethics, but also about the ethics of geoengineering. In order to talk about the history of temperature change on Earth, I'm drawing from one of my former instructors, John Baez, who's a mathematician at UC Riverside. He's very interested in climate change, and this is sort of just scientific background on temperature change. Also, a lot of my discussion of geoengineering is coming from work that was done by my friend, who was formerly a postdoc at USC in a geosciences department working on the ethics of geoengineering. He put together this lecture, which is a video on YouTube, and a presentation. And a lot of the things I'm going to say here, I'm just taking directly from John. I also have a scholarly article on the ethics of geoengineering, and a lot of resources on climate change, including this Bloomberg infographic, which I like quite a lot, and I'll show you in just a few seconds. But I want to start by going through some facts of climate change. The first biggest fact here is that CO2 content in the atmosphere strongly correlates with surface temperature. As the carbon in the atmosphere goes up, temperature also goes up, and as carbon in the atmosphere falls, then temperature also falls. And you can see that it rises and falls quite dramatically over the history of Earth. This is just the last 800,000 years. And you see fluctuations of 6 or 9 degrees Celsius in temperature, or hundreds of parts per million carbon content in the atmosphere. So these kinds of fluctuations are not unheard of. It's happened in history before, and sometimes quite dramatic changes. Adding more carbon to the atmosphere, because they don't match exactly. There's other things that also affect temperature and carbon content. So these aren't exactly matching, but you can see that they strongly correlate over Earth's history. And so we use carbon in the atmosphere to study the history of temperature. The data here is all taken from ice core samples. And if CO2 correlates with surface temperature, then putting a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere is also going to raise temperatures. So this is exactly what we've been doing. We've been dumping a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, and other greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. Right now we're at 412 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When I last made this slide in 2017, which is 2 years ago, the number on the NASA website was 407. So we've risen 5 parts per million in just the last 2 years. And you can see it's exponential growth. And right now, 412 parts per million is much higher than it has ever been in the history of humanity, Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens as a species have only been around for maybe 150 or 200,000 years at most. We've been so-called behaviorally modern for the last maybe 80,000 years. So human history, human evolution is all in this last little bit. Neanderthals and other Homo great apes came before us and sort of survived in these fluctuating temperatures. This is the last glaciation event, the last ice age. There were woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers around prior to this last glaciation. But civilization is all in this last maybe 12,000 years. And in just the last 60 or 70 years, maybe the last industrial age, maybe 100, 150 years, we've been, because of industrialization, the burning of fossil fuels, we've been putting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that weren't there before. All of this carbon in the atmosphere has skyrocketed both carbon content and temperatures. Right now, carbon is much higher than it's been in the last 800,000 years, and well outside the evolutionary environment for Homo sapiens. We'll come back to that temperature history soon, but the result, if carbon is correlated with temperature and carbon is rising, then temperature is also rising. So here is a rather dramatic graph showing this. Here at 0 degrees Celsius is 0 degrees relative to the temperature, the average temperature between 1850 and 1900. So 1850 and 1900 is already in industrialization, but the average temperature is somewhere in this range, 56 degrees. I'll let the graphic play again, 56 degrees, and it stays around there for about 50 years. But you can see that over the last, especially the last 50 years, 60 years, the temperature has been ballooning out, and that the circle here becomes much wider. We are on course, so this is close to present day. Here we go, and the rate at increase, the acceleration of temperature change, is going faster and faster. So we're expected to reach somewhere near 6 degrees Celsius by the turn of the century, by 2100. 2100 is maybe not in your lifetime, but maybe in your children's lifetimes, possibly in your lifetime, depending on what happens, but very likely in your children's lifetime, and certainly in their children's lifetime. This is not outside of living memory. I mean, there are people alive today who were born in early 1900s. So this is going to be within living memory that we're going to experience 6 degrees Celsius temperature change. And I should say that 6 degrees Celsius temperature change is a pretty dramatic state of affairs. It's hard to grow things like wheat and corn in temperature fluctuations of 6 degrees Celsius. I mean, you might think of the difference between 85 and 87 degrees is not very much. And if we're talking about on a day-to-day basis, 1 or 2 degrees doesn't seem like very much. But in terms of global climate, in terms of average temperature for the global climate, that 6 degrees has dramatic consequences on the kinds of things that can grow, on the places that people can live, on sea level rises. So there's going to be lots to contend with as this number gets higher and higher and higher. Even around 3 degrees Celsius, we're going to see dramatic changes in in agriculture and in human political interactions. Yeah, like I said, 6 degrees Celsius, you can't grow wheat very easily. You can't grow corn very easily. We don't know how to feed a global population without wheat and corn. These are agricultural staples that feed the 7 billion people on the planet. Of course, not every place is going to see 6 degrees Celsius warming. Some places might see more warming. Some places might see less warming. Some places might even see some cooling. Most agriculture is going to have to move away from the equator because that's places where it's going to be very hot. Okay, so temperatures are going up. Greenhouse gases are also going up. Are these things necessarily related? Well, yes. In fact, greenhouse gases are really the only thing, especially CO2, really the only thing that can explain the rising temperatures. If you look at, Earth is a complex dynamical system. Lots of things change the temperature, including the life that lives on it, the atmospheric content, but also things like the place in its orbit around the sun. Activity on the sun also can have an effect on Earth's temperature. So it's a very complicated system. Lots of things are going on here. But if you look at all of the things that impact climate, global temperature, you can see that those things don't really change very much over the time period that we're looking at. The biggest change, and the one that correlates most directly with the rising temperatures, is the rise in greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases have been going up, and so have temperatures in almost an exactly matching pattern. The rest of the things that change, like how much sunlight is hitting Earth, changes to solar radiation. and other things. Maybe the biggest other variation here you see is the stratospheric aerosols. An aerosol is just any particulate matter, like little droplets of anything, where the droplets are less than a micrometer in size. If it's less than a micrometer, that makes it an aerosol. So some of these aerosols are from human manufacturing, like in hairspray, whatever the things go in those aerosol cans. There used to be CFCs. I think those are outlawed now, but those things used to go up in the atmosphere and ruin the ozone layer and so on. Not only human-created aerosols, though, lots of other things create these stratospheric and tropospheric aerosols. Volcanoes erupting will release lots of particulate matter into the atmosphere, and this can also cause temperature changes. Aerosols tend to block sunlight, and so when you get lots of aerosols, when aerosols rise in the atmosphere, you end up getting cooling results. So these changes in aerosol behavior result in sort of overall cooling effects on the planet. So if it was just the aerosol effect, you would expect temperature to go down. But in fact, that's not what we see. We see temperature rising, and temperature rising almost exactly in correlation with greenhouse gas changes. Here's another a chart saying basically the same thing. Another part to add here is that it's not just changes in greenhouse gases, but it's in particular the changes in greenhouse gases caused by human activity. So if you look at the amount of change in temperature, we're warming this amount, not quite a full degree, a little bit over half degree. And then the greenhouse gas changes have been huge. The other anthropogenic forcing, like those aerosols, those stratospheric aerosols, cause a slight cooling event, and so the overall relationship between the warming forcings and the cooling forcings result in about this much change, which is very close to how much warmth, how much change in overall temperature we're seeing. Comparatively, the changes in natural forcings, things like volcanic activity and solar activity, is very, very small. The changes we're seeing to global temperature is very large. The only comparable large change is in greenhouse gases, and all the other changes are relatively small. The best example I have of this is from this Bloomberg article, which is on this skeptical page. I want to show you the Bloomberg infographic real quickly, but some people are still, maybe it's less common nowadays because the impact of climate change has become so obvious, but it's still largely a political issue. And we know how to stop climate change from a technical and scientific point of view. Like we know what's happening. We know how to change it. The fact that we're not changing it is largely a result of politics. It's a result of the influence of the oil industry in our politics. We saw some of that influence in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill case. And just like in the smoking case, where the cigarette companies, the tobacco companies, would deny the health consequences of cigarettes, for years, even after it was medically very clear that there were significant health risks, even after 500,000 people every year were dying, the tobacco companies still refused to acknowledge the harm that they were causing with their products. The oil industry is doing the same thing. It's taking a playbook from tobacco, and for decades, the energy industry has known. Its own scientists have conducted research knowing that changes in global atmospheric carbon has consequences for the overall temperature, and researchers within the oil industry have come to these conclusions on their own, and then have worked very hard to suppress that research and cause political confusion. If you are at all skeptical, or if you've ever been skeptical of climate change, it's very likely that you were convinced or persuaded or influenced by propaganda from the oil industry. The oil industry pays lots and lots of money to spread deceptive studies and to pay researchers to make false claims, to make it seem like there's more doubt among the scientific community. There's more doubt in order to delay and postpone and otherwise stymie the political action on climate change. So the prevalence of skepticism is a direct result of energy industry propaganda, and there are a set of sort of standard skeptical challenges to climate change, some of which you've probably heard before and some of which you probably know how to answer, but you see people say that maybe the climate change is real, maybe temperatures are changing, but it's not really the result of human activity. Some might say that these are just natural cycles, and nature has these cycles where it gets hotter and gets colder, it rises and falls, and this is all just a part of a natural cycle, and nature will correct itself, nature will reach its own balance, and part of the implication here is that there's some kind of hubris in thinking that humans have such a big impact on the climate that we represent some sort of threat to the environment or threat to ourselves. So a lot of people will deny that climate change is even happening, or they will deny that human beings are responsible for the climate change, or they will blame the climate change on some natural process, and in order to avoid human responsibility, or in order to avoid human action. So, as we've already talked about, there's lots of things that change the global temperature, changes the Earth's orbit. These are called the Milankovitch cycles, how the Earth is tilted relative to the Sun and the position in its orbit. Changes in solar activity also changes Earth's temperature. And like I said, things like volcanoes, wildfires, other sources that put carbon in the atmosphere. These are sort of natural changes. These are non-anthropogenic changes. But the anthropogenic changes, the human-caused changes to global climate, are things like land use, like deforestation. Deforestation ends up actually being a source of cooling because forests are dark, and so they absorb energy from the sun. They raise temperatures. But when you cut down the forest, it's just the bare earth, and the bare earth is brighter and it reflects the light. And so when you cut down a bunch of trees, it ends up cooling the earth a little bit. But that's not a good thing for climate change because even though the temperatures rise a little bit because of forests, those forests are also pulling lots of carbon out of the atmosphere. I mean, plants, the body of plants, the material of plants are carbon-based life forms just like us, and the carbon that plants get to make their bodies, they're pulling out of the air. Photosynthesis is a way of using the sun and it breathes carbon dioxide. It pulls carbon dioxide out of the air. It uses the carbon to turn into the stuff that's made of its bodies. That its body is made of. A plant pulls water and other nutrients out of the soil, but the bulk of its body, the carbon in its body, is pulled out of the air. So plants take the sun and turn it into their bodies. Sometimes we don't appreciate how important the gases are to our ecosystem, to sort of biological, to how life works, and especially how much the atmospheric gases weigh. So plants turn carbon in the atmosphere into their bodies, and when you lose weight, when you like exercise, and maybe you run on a treadmill for a couple of weeks and you lose a couple of pounds, the pounds that you lost were lost by breathing them out in carbon. When you lose weight through your lungs, through respiration, and the bulk of that weight is in carbon dioxide that you're breathing out of your lungs. The weight that you lose is not usually lost through digestion and excretion or urination. Urination is passing out water that you drink. Excretion is passing out food that you eat. Some of that food sticks around to burn energy, and when you burn that energy, the result is carbon dioxide that you breathe out, and a lot of the weight that you're losing is lost through your lungs. So if you lose 20 pounds through exercise, you lost 20 pounds through you breathed out 20 pounds of carbon through your lungs. This way of thinking about sort of gas exchange, especially for humans, is not very normal. But this is sort of how you have to think in order to get into this science. So, let me come over to the browser. I want to go through this Bloomberg article. It's going to say a lot of the things. It's going to show a lot of the things I've already said, but I find it's a very useful infographic. And if you know people who are skeptical, or if you've never seen a graphic like this might help. So what this graphic does is it just compares the rise in temperature. So we've seen this graph already, but here's a little more detailed graph of the rise in temperature from 1880 to 2014. This article's from 2015, so it's a little bit old. But the facts in here are all the same. So the temperature has risen since the average from the 19th century. And so we can compare the rising temperature to these other climate temperature forcing processes, like changes in the Earth's orbit. So Earth's orbit changes slightly. Again, these are the Milankovitch cycles. They move back and forth. We understand how that works pretty well. We can predict its impact on temperature. And here's the relative impact on temperature of Earth's orbital changes. It's relatively small compared to the rise in temperature that we're actually seeing. Similarly, changes to the sun. I hear this a lot from climate change deniers saying that it's just solar activity. The sun is changing, and this happens every year, and there's just sort of this natural cycle. The sun is actually maybe the most stable object in the solar system. It's been around doing what it's doing for like hundreds of millions of years. It's going to keep doing this for quite a long time. The sun is a very, very stable object. It does have activity. That activity does have an impact on temperature, but the fluctuations in solar activity are not big enough to explain rise in temperature that we've seen recently. What about volcanoes? Volcanoes put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. That carbon is going to have a cooling effect. So when you see rises in volcanic activity, you're going to actually see dips in global temperature. And we see a couple of these dips over the last 100 years or so. But again, those dips should make temperatures cooler, and they don't explain the rising temperatures that we see. So those are the natural processes. What if it's some combination of all three of those things? Well, that doesn't. If you sort of combine those in the natural way, you get some change. You get some impact to global temperatures, but you should get this cooling event. We do see the cooling here, maybe correlated with this cooling. Maybe some of this cooling here is also correlated with this volcanic activity. So maybe there is an impact of this volcanic activity, but it's not an impact that explains the general rise in temperatures that we're seeing. Okay, so what about anthropogenic activity, things like deforestation? Well, again, deforestation is going to cause temperatures to go down just a little bit. So as land use goes up, as temperatures, as forests, the overall surface coverage of forests goes down, you see temperatures cooling a little bit. And again, that's not going to explain the rise in temperatures. What about ozone pollution? This is the atmospheric anthropogenic changes to ozone because of things like aerosols that destroy ozone. So again, you see some fluctuation in ozone that has some result on the change in temperature, but again, it's very, very small. What about aerosol pollution? Yeah, this is those upper atmospheric aerosols that we've put out there. Again, you see the confidence level here. 95% confidence is within these bounds, but the aerosols are not explaining the rise in temperature. In fact, aerosols should explain a decrease in temperature. So again, is it greenhouse gases? Well, greenhouse gases are rising in exactly the curve that you see here, correlated with temperature. Again, we know that temperature and greenhouse gases are strongly correlating over the history of planet Earth, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. And none of the other activity really explains. None of the other activity really explains what's going on here. So, if you take all of the factors and combine them, you get a good explanation. If it's just the greenhouse gases. But the other activity sort of doesn't make sense. It's not the kind of thing that explains. So again, sometimes you see people say, "Oh, it's just sunspots or this changes solar activity." These people just really don't know what they're talking about. They're really not looking at the science. The science makes it very clear that it's changes in greenhouse gases that are anthropogenic in origin, that are the result of human-forced climate change. So let me come back to the presentation here. So I like that graphic. Maybe you find that helpful. I think it's already the case, though, that too much of our conversation has been on whether climate change is real. The big issue is not whether it's real. It's obviously real. The big issue is what do we do about it? So knowing what to do about it really means understanding what it amounts to. As I said earlier, we're on track for 6 degrees Celsius change by rising temperature change by 2100. You can see here that the rising temperature change, it's not all over the planet the same, but there's going to be hot spots, especially around the equator, and especially in the northern hemisphere where these greenhouse gases tend to accumulate. This is partly why the northern ice cap is melting. And you can also see here in sort of agricultural regions where we grow a lot of our food, will get very, very hot. The way that the IPCC is the international Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC is run through the UN. So the UN uses its contacts to all the different countries and gets a bunch of scientists from all the different countries together to come to some consensus about what's actually happening with global climate change. This is what the IPCC has done for a long time now. For a long time, they've been compiling these reports about expectations of climate change. And the way they do this is that they have lots of different models. The models have different assumptions about how to interpret the data that we have, how to predict and anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And you can see here, and there's lots and lots of models, and you can see all of these different lines are different models that the IPCC runs to look at different likelihood situations. And the way that IPCC reports work is that they group these models into 4 kinds. So RPC 2.6, RPC 4.5, RPC 6, and RPC 8.5. So the RPC 2.6 is the situation where all of the countries decide to stop emitting carbon. We all go carbon neutral or sort of net carbon negative in the very near future, and the change in temperature sort of radically reverses. So this is sort of a U-turn. Like right now we're on path for rising carbon, rising temperatures, and if nothing changes, we're on the RCP 8.5 path that comes up here, where we're we're around 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So that's if we do nothing, we're in one of these red paths. If we completely change our ways, we're in one of the blue paths. It seems like the blue paths are very unlikely, and it seems like the red paths are very, very likely. We're not doing enough to get ourselves off these red paths. And the longer we wait, the more radical the change has to be to U-turn us into one of these blue or even yellow paths. So again, if we do nothing, or if we stay on the course that we're on one of these red paths, going very high, getting very hot. The IPCC continues to model these 2.6 scenarios where we radically turn things around, but the actual governments are not adopting policies that reflect this capacity to turn around. And so again, the later we're going, the harder it's going to be, the more dramatic changes we're going to have to take in order to U-turn the global climate into something that's actually reasonable. Part of the issue here is that it's really hard to model the climate. It's one of the most complex systems we've ever studied. There's a lot of factors going into how the climate works. Sometimes I see in popular media that people say that the human brain is the most complicated thing we've ever studied, the most complicated thing that exists. But the global climate is made out of 7 billion brains and a lot of other stuff as well. The way that temperature changes on the planet is incredibly fascinating thing, and being able to anticipate how it changes in the future, it takes all the world scientists and researchers collaborating on these very, very big projects, and their predictions and anticipations, the way that they model climate change, has changed and updated over the years as we've gotten better data, as our modeling science has gotten a lot better. These estimates have changed, and the way they've changed is they've always gotten worse. That we've always learned that we've been too optimistic about how likely it is that we're going to change. So here in 2007, from one of their reports, in 2007, they modeled the likely futures here, and again you see the red, very high temperature one. You see the yellow where we turn it around or sort of stabilize. But you see here that the red temperature that they're looking at, they're estimating by 2100 that the most extreme cases are still around 4 degrees Celsius, or maybe just slightly under 4. And notice how that changes by 2014. So this is IPCC releasing their new report in 2014. That report has by 2100 in the worst case scenarios near 6 degrees Celsius, 5.8 or so, and possibly even higher than that. Right? So what we've learned in the 7 years between 2007 and 2014 is that our estimates of the worst case scenario were not bad enough, that we were in fact optimistic about what the worst case scenario looks like, that we were underestimating how rapidly things change. And part of the problem here is that there's a lot of feedback loops in the climate that that help to regulate the temperature. And when those feedback loops go, things start to accelerate really fast. So the polar ice cap in the North Pole is one of these temperature regulators. Just the fact that there's a big block of ice up there tends to keep the temperature stable and not fluctuating wildly with Earth's temperature. But as that polar ice cap goes away, then that stabilizer on global temperature also goes away, and things tend to accelerate very quickly. So these are all the models, and you see that they're estimating they're going to get very bad. One of the challenges of a lot of this discussion is that estimating out to 2100 is a little bit hard for people today in 2019, 2020 to be able to imagine. 2100 seems like a long time away. It seems like it's outside of the scope of my life, and so it's hard to motivate concern for what happens in 2100. And so it's maybe even more important to think about not 2100 and what the sort of worst case scenario is going to be in 2100, but what we actually are looking at in the next few years. And you can see in this more recent 2014 report that there's something like an inflection point around 2050. So all of these models basically agree that by 2050 we're going to be at 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So things are going to get really hot, even in the near term. By 2050, 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the issue is that there's like an inflection point here where we can hit 1.5 and then keep going up, or we can hit 1.5 and then stabilize right after that. And it's all really down to this very near-term future between now and 2050, and even between now and 2030. And 2050 and 2030 is definitely in the lifetime of the students taking this class. This is not some far future thing that your children have to worry about. This is your lifetime right now. And the most recent IPCC reports are telling us that if we don't take significant action by 2030, so like in the next 10 years, if we don't take significant climate action to radically change the amount of carbon dioxide we're releasing in the atmosphere, then we miss this inflection point and we end up in one of the red zone here. In order to stay in the blue zones, in order to stabilize our rising temperatures, we have to take action now in the next decade. After 2030, there won't be things that we can do to keep us from the worst case scenarios. After 2030, we sort of condemn ourselves to the very worst cases. So yeah, we have to do something. The global climate is an incredibly complex system. There's no simple cycles in the climate. It's just there's lots of feedback processes that all have to be taken into account. Modeling how these things change is very difficult. I have an animation here that I love. This is from just a couple of years ago. I think it was 2015 or 2014 that NASA did the supercomputer modeling of global greenhouse gases. So this is a supercomputer model taken from data from 2006, trying to simulate that data. And what you see here is not just carbon dioxide, which is in the red, the blue and red stuff, but also carbon monoxide, which is gray. And this is over the whole year, 2006. So now we're in March 2006. So it's starting to be spring. You can see that a lot of this carbon is coming from a couple of places here in the United States, here in Europe, and then here in Eastern Asia, in Japan, and China, India. There's some industry here in Africa and here in South America, but really not a lot. And a lot of that industry is just here in the northern hemisphere. Another really big thing to see here is that once that carbon is emitted into the atmosphere, it goes everywhere. Like there's no way to tell of any individual carbon molecule, whether it came from America or whether it came from China. I think one of the things I like most about the simulation, it's really beautiful. It was one of the biggest computer simulations ever done. The amount of supercomputer time needed to run a simulation of this magnitude is astonishing. Here you see spring, summer, when all the plants come out and they suck up all the carbon. So all that red goes away. The plants don't breathe carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide just stays in the atmosphere. But all the carbon dioxide almost goes away by the summer. And the thing that takes it out of the atmosphere are plants, the trees and the plants that are breathing that carbon just take it out of the atmosphere. And it's very dramatic. You saw just in a couple of months, it went from almost all red to fairly almost nothing at all. And you'll see that as fall and then winter comes and the plants, a lot of the plants go away, the atmospheric carbon starts to come back. But yeah, so one of the things I really like about this simulation is it shows how much climate change is a global problem. It's not just a local, regional problem. It's something that we, if every country in the world stops emitting carbon except the U.S. and China, then it's still a global problem, right? So this is not something that can be solved on an individual, local basis. This is something that requires a global solution. And part of the problem is that we don't have the political infrastructure for engineering this kind of global solution, right? Maybe the UN is the closest thing we have to a kind of world government that can make decisions on a global scale. But that's not really how the UN works. It doesn't make a lot of sort of unilateral decisions like that. In order to make any decisions at all, the UN requires global collaboration. Engineering that global collaboration is very hard, and it'll just get more difficult as the climate situation gets worse, as temperatures get higher, as agriculture starts to fail around the globe, and people are in more dire situations. It'll be more and more difficult to engineer, to negotiate, and collaborate on global solutions. And the political issues here are political and ethical issues here are very complicated. But before we get to this, I want to give, not just talking about the climate situation that we're in right now, but some context for the history of climate change over Earth's history, so that we see how this is not just a sort of immediate story of our generation, but it's really a story of Earth's history. This is a story of the development of Earth. Humanity has left its record on the surface of the Earth, and it'll be around long after we are. Okay, so I want to tell the big picture story of temperature change. And again, a lot of this comes from John Baez's page on temperature change. A lot of these images come from his page that he sort of sourced. So this is the first image. This is actually supposed to be one image where this is on top of this part, but this goes from the present all the way back to the start of Earth. Earth is 4.6 billion years old or so. So 4.6 billion years ago, and then as we go up this graph here on the right, this is 225 million years ago and 65 million years ago, and then the present. And then the present is where this middle line is. So the present temperature, you can imagine, is this middle line. And so as we go back through to the past, you see that temperature has fluctuated pretty dramatically. When Earth starts out, it's a big ball of molten rock, so it's very, very hot, but eventually cools down. In fact, it eventually cools down quite dramatically and becomes an ice ball. This is sort of ice ball or snowball Earth, where the Earth is covered in ice, is covered in snow, and is very reflective. So something turned Earth's temperature around from being very, very hot molten ball of rock into an ice ball. And it maybe happened a couple of times. And we'd really like to know what does that. Especially we'd like to know what sort of gets it to cool down so dramatically. What gets it to cool down so dramatically, but then also what gets it to warm back up again. Part of the puzzle here is that an Earth covered in ice or snow is going to be very reflective, and there's not going to be enough sunlight or heat from sunlight to heat up or melt the snow. So the dramatic drop in temperature and then the sort of starting to fluctuate in temperature is probably not just a result of geological processes, but also probably living processes, that the composition of life on Earth changes the atmospheric content, and that causes these sort of dramatic fluctuations in temperature. And in fact, that's what you see throughout history here, is that you have these dramatic fluctuations in temperature. It's not an easy cycle. It's not like a sine wave going up throughout history that goes, sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold. It's like a nice, easy cycle. There is no easy cycle here. The climate is too complex. There's no sort of easy pattern that explains when it gets hot and when it gets cold. If you look at this is a sort of characteristically chaotic process. Sort of no easy patterns. What you do see, though, is that it gets hot and it gets cold. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes very, very cold, sometimes it's very hot. During the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, this is like the reign of the dinosaurs. You can see it's very hot, and the heat corresponds not with really big animals and really high carbon content in the atmosphere. This is maybe one of the other important lessons, is that the global temperature is not just making a habitat for life to live in, but that life is actively influencing the temperature, that life changes the atmospheric content and so changes the Earth's temperature in a feedback process. The global climate is directly linked in a very close way with the kinds of life on Earth. When global climate changes, when the atmospheric conditions change, so too does the composition of life on Earth change. Right? So when it's very hot, you get big dinosaurs, and as things cool down, you get smaller creatures, the mammals, and so on. This relationship between temperature and life on Earth can be very direct. There's phytoplankton on the ocean that, so if it's the open ocean, so clouds in the atmosphere form around dust particles. Like you can get water in the atmosphere, but then it's just water vapor, but it doesn't form a cloud unless there's something for that water vapor to cling around to in order to form a cloud. So you need dust particles in the atmosphere, and in the open ocean, like way in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's not a lot of dust flying around. It's because it's all water, so there's not a lot of dust flying around. But the being exposed directly to the sunlight is damaging, harmful to the phytoplankton that live on the surface of the ocean, even out in the open ocean. And so, in order to shade themselves from the sun, phytoplankton will release little sulfur particles into the atmosphere, and those sulfur particles eventually allow clouds to accumulate around them in order to block out the sun, in order to protect that phytoplankton in the ocean. So this is sort of a very close feedback loop where these tiny organisms in the ocean are directly causing clouds that block the sun and change the temperature in order to sustain their life, in order to allow them to stay alive. So, but this kind of process is happening on large scales for all life. The composition of the atmosphere is in direct feedback with the life on Earth, and when the life changes, so too does the atmosphere, and when the atmosphere changes, so too does the life. So for this reason, it's part of the climate change that human beings are causing right now is not just a result of human ethics, it's really part of geological history. And so I want to talk more about geological history here. Maybe because we're talking about life, we can give a little sort of image of life on Earth. This is my favorite image of the tree of life. So the way this image works is that it starts at the center 4.6 billion years ago. When Earth starts, you don't get life on Earth until a few 100 million years after that. But life is originally these single-celled organisms. Eventually, they start to diversify and differentiate, and eventually you get the Cambrian explosion. So here life starts, and these are all the branches of life. And out here on the rim is today. So today is this huge diversity of life, lots of different species, lots of different sort of branches in the tree of life. We're all related to each other. If you go back 50,000 generations, we're all cousins. But there's this huge amount of diversity in life today. Sometimes people tend to think that humans are more highly evolved than birds or fish or lizards, but that's not true. The highly evolved here is from the outside to the inside, and all of the animals alive today have been evolving for that same length of time, right? So the lizards today have been evolving for millions of years in their current form, or hundreds of millions of years in their current form, and eventually related to mammals, and we all have sort of share this family tree. You can also see in this image the mass extinction events. So there's a Cambrian explosion where life suddenly diversifies and you get lots of different kinds of animals. But then you also have these extinction events. And these extinction events are where you see the sort of culling of the right. So the expansion outward here is sort of development of the tree of life. But then you have these sort of angled in sections where lots of living creatures die. Here, this big gap here is the dinosaurs, where all of those branches in the tree of life ended up getting eliminated for various reasons. Life goes extinct all the time. We've had several major extinction events over Earth's history. This is from the Wikipedia page on extinction events, and the number on the side here is percentage of species that were extinct, that were made to go extinct at these different times. So this is 500 million years ago, Cambrian explosion. And several times here you see these major extinction events where huge percentage, 40%, 50% of the species on Earth go extinct. 50% of the species on Earth go extinct. Maybe here's the biggest extinction event right before the Triassic. This is the KT event, sometimes called. This is what killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That was a big extinction event. Maybe 30% of life, 30% of the species died, but it's not as big as this extinction event where lots of animals died. One of the very early extinction events, before any of the big animals come around, is when one of the organisms learned how to produce oxygen. Learned how to process carbon dioxide and in the process produce oxygen. Before that organism learned how to produce oxygen through its sort of natural metabolic processes, producing oxygen, before it learned how to produce oxygen, no other creature on the planet used or needed oxygen in that way or produced oxygen as part of any life process. And to all those other organisms, oxygen was a poison. It was toxic. It killed lots of things. So one of these very early extinction events, one organism learned how to produce oxygen and killed off all the other organisms, changed the composition of the atmosphere to raise the oxygen content, and that killed off a bunch of organisms that just couldn't handle that oxygen in the atmosphere. So a major extinction event. In fact, this has happened several times in the past. Some of these extinction events, like the dinosaur extinction event, the KT event, might have been caused by asteroids and rocks hitting the planet. But some of these, in fact, several of these extinction events are caused by changes to biology and how certain organisms find tricks that are radically disruptive to the rest of the ecosystem that cause massive extinction events. So it has happened in Earth's history before that some organism figures out some trick that changes the atmospheric composition, changes global climate in a way that's dramatic and causes mass extinction events to lots of other organisms. And we are in exactly such an extinction event. We are in the Anthropocene, which is the extinction event, which is the period of geological history characterized by human forced climate change, which has resulted in extinction events of all sorts up and down the tree. So we are in an extinction event of the sort that has happened on Earth's history several times in the past. Maybe this should make us feel a little bit better about climate change. Like maybe it's not our fault. Maybe this is just what organisms tend to do when they get too big and when they figure out too clever of a trick. Before I talk more about climate change today, just going through this history. So we looked at the big history from 4.6 billion years ago, but it's maybe more relevant to look at more recent history. So this is history of the last 65 million years. So this is since the KT event. KT event 65 million years ago destroyed the dinosaurs, and after that is the age of mammals. So all the mammals evolved in this period, the last 65 million years. The primates evolved like 20 million years ago. And again, like Homo sapiens, the earliest humans are maybe 1 million years ago, and Homo sapiens maybe 200,000 years ago. So all of human history is right at the very edge, the right edge of this graph. Humans don't come on the scene until very late here. Mammals evolved in this whole period. Mammals were around even during the dinosaurs, but we sort of come into our own during this period. And you can see that the period of mammals at some points were much, much hotter than they are today. In fact, what the graph looks like is that we're kind of in a cooling trajectory, that overall, over the last 65 million years, the Earth has cooled off something like maybe 10 degrees Celsius. Some significant cooling events over the last 65 million years ago. It is much colder. Is much cooler on average today than it was 65 million years ago. It was hotter during the dinosaurs. It's cooled off a lot since. And you can see again that the graph here is very complex. There's no easy cycles. It fluctuates pretty rapidly. There's long periods of relative stability, like this. This period is maybe a relatively stable place, but it's sort of radically changed from its surrounding environment. Here's the cooling that we're in. It's also a lot more dense because we have a lot more data from this period, because the more recent it is, the more data we can easily gather. One thing I want to point out here is the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So this is the Paleocene, this is the Eocene, and right at the border between the Paleocene in Eocene about 55 million years ago is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This is the hottest it gets over this whole 65 million years. This is the hottest point in recent Earth history. And what's really interesting about it is that it's a spike in the temperature that happens fairly quickly. You see just a little bit before that, temperatures are fairly cool, but then it spikes sort of abnormally considering the rest of the trajectory. And you get the spike, and then it drops back down to where it was just before then. So this spike in temperature is about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. So it's about the magnitude of change that we're experiencing right now. And this makes it very interesting to scientists. They want to know what caused the spike and what brought it back down again. Especially what brought it back down again, it would be very helpful to know how things cooled off so rapidly. We know about the PETM from a couple of different data sources, so it's very interesting. The scary thing about the PETM, so it seems sort of comparable to what we're experiencing today. The scary thing, though, is that, remember, this is a 65 million year chart, so this is a huge time scale, and the time from the trough to peak to trough to go through this PETM thermal maximum was something like on the order of 200,000 years, 170,000 years, from the bottom to the top to the bottom. So 170,000 years to do this 4 degrees Celsius temperature change. 170,000 years is really quick. It's like a flash. It's like a blink of the eye in Earth's history. And so you have this sort of blink of the eye rapid temperature change. But from human perspective, 170,000 years is about as long as we've been evolving as Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens have been on Earth for about 170,000 years at most. So the temperature change that we're experiencing today, about 4 degrees Celsius, is happening not in the order of hundreds of thousands of years, but in the order of 100 years, maybe 150 years. Several orders of magnitude faster than the biggest spike in this recent history. So this is some context for how dramatic the changes are in Earth's temperature change right now. The kind of spike that's going to be left with the geological record of the temperature changes right now is going to be bigger than the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And it's also going to be briefer. It's going to happen quicker, more quickly. So we looked at 65,000 years. 65 million years. Coming even closer to the present. This is the last 5 million years. 5 million years. Again, you see the sort of relative cooling event. You start to also see these glaciation cycles. I said earlier that there's no easy cycles in Earth's climate. There are some cycles. These cycles have partly to do with Milankovitch cycles, with cycles in Earth's rotation, and other sort of geological activity. But what these cycles are, so it's a change in frequency of these cycles, and it's the frequency and how frequently it's going from a peak of relatively warm period to the trough of relatively cool period. And these are the sort of ice ages of the last 5 million years. Every one of these troughs is another sort of ice age or glaciation event where the Earth gets very cold. So this happens pretty frequently, where it cools down and warms up, cools down and warms up. This general pattern, again, is strongly influenced by the Milankovitch cycles, but this is not the pattern that we're seeing right now. Here's even closer to the present. This is just last 1.35 million years. So again, this is within the range of like the evolution of human beings. Maybe this is sort of slightly better. The earliest Australopithecine ancestors that are sort of on the branch of human evolution show up around 2 million years ago. So this is like all of human evolution. We're primates before that. Primates come in around 20 million years ago. So human evolution is all in this last little bit. Human evolution happens entirely within the span of this period right here. And again, you see temperature changes pretty rapidly, pretty dramatically, 5-6 degrees, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius change over this history. So human beings have evolved for global climate that fluctuates pretty rapidly. We have not evolved for a stable climate system. Our evolutionary ancestors experienced dramatic temperature changes. This is part of why humans evolved the way that we did. We moved around the planet. We found new places to live, partly because temperatures changed. Where we were living got too cold, and we needed to move to warmer temperatures, or where we were living got too hot, and we needed to find colder places. And it's this drive to find better temperature scenarios that is why human beings eventually left Africa and went and, or at least the humans that did leave Africa left Africa and found and eventually populated the entire planet. Eventually found their way onto all the continents except Antarctica until more recently, and then made lives for themselves. It was in response to these fluctuating temperatures. So for tens of thousands of years, human beings have had to deal with changes in temperatures, and all of our cultural habits and our psychological patterns of behavior, our sociality, comes as a result of dealing with these fluctuations in temperature. So here's just the last 100,000 years. Again, this is behavioral modernity. It happens around 80,000 years ago. Behavioral modernity is when Homo sapiens start acting like what we would think of as humans. They start having language. They start having clear social practices. They start making tools. They train fire. Fire gets trained maybe 50 or 60,000 years ago. The first dogs are domesticated around 30,000 years ago. So this is the period where we think of like the Stone Age, the last 100,000 years. And these are the temperature fluctuations that our Stone Age ancestors were dealing with while they expanded and occupied the globe. And you can see in this chart, finally, our very recent history. So this last dip in temperature is the last glaciation event. It's called the Younger Dryas. And since again, this is the glaciation event where we last saw the saber-toothed tigers and the woolly mammoths. But before then, there were saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths. Then glaciation event happens, and then it starts to warm up, and that's when all the saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths go extinct. And then you can see in this chart that after that glaciation, after the Younger Dryas glaciation event, temperature starts to rise and stabilize. And in fact, we have this long period of about 12,000 years where temperature is as warm and stable as it's been at any other point in this recent history. Let me show you another image of this. And I think this is maybe the most troubling, disturbing of the graphs that I'm going to show you of this history, now that we're near the present. So again, temperatures fluctuate. We have this last glaciation event, the Younger Dryas, where things get cold for a while, and then it starts to warm up. The saber-toothed tigers die off and go extinct. And then you have temperatures reaching a warm period. So it's this warm period of time over the last 12,000 years or so. This is called the Holocene from a geological perspective. This is the most recent geological perspective is the Holocene. And it's characterized by this unusual stability. Temperatures do fluctuate, but the range of fluctuation is relatively minor to how it was fluctuating in the just recent past before the last glaciation event. And if you know from human history, all of what we might call a civilization, where we come out of the Stone Age and we become what we think of today as civilized human beings, where we learn writing, not just that we start using language, but we learn writing, we learn money, we learn sophisticated agricultural techniques, we stop being hunter-gatherers wandering around. A lot of us stop becoming hunter-gatherers wandering around, and instead we form large cities and we form agricultural communities. We form religion and money. We form the ideas of kings and lords who rule over those agricultural communities and lay down laws. So all of this stuff, every human religion that you know about, every human practice, every human belief, every human language that you know about, human beings have been around for a long time, maybe 100,000 years, 150,000 years. But civilization has only been around for about 12,000 years. All of the writing, reading, all of the religious stories that you know, all of the cultural practices that you know, happen in just these last 12,000 years. We like to tell ourselves that human beings are the most intelligent creatures on the planet, and that we have all of our luxuries, the luxuries of civilization, that we have all of these because of our incredible intelligence and because of our big brains. And that it was really our intelligence, our rationality, that allowed us to sort of step outside of nature and become civilized human beings. But this is just hubris. This is an overinflated sense of our own capabilities. In fact, if you look at the record, it's not because we were really smart that agriculture takes off. It's not because we figured out some ingenious technique that agriculture takes off. In fact, we were plenty smart before then. We had tools and language, and we were humans. We were humans just like you and I today before civilization happened. What happened in the last 12,000 years is not some innovation of human intelligence. What happened in the last 12,000 years is that the climate stabilized in order to allow us to not move around so much. It allowed us to plant crops and to be able to anticipate that those crops would come in, and in order to plan our cities, plan our society around predictable and regular climate cycles. Again, the climate hasn't been perfect over these last 12,000 years. There have been cool events, there have been warm events, and some of these cooling events correlate with droughts and famines from history, and some of these warming events also correlate with famines. But this relative instability in the climate is small compared to the historical instability that human beings have had to live with. So over the last 12,000 years, we've settled down. We stopped moving around. We stopped being hunter-gatherers because the climate allowed it. And the big lesson here is that the climate doesn't allow it anymore. Right? This period of stable temperature is gone. It's over. We've put so much carbon in the atmosphere that temperatures are going to rise, and we've knocked ourselves out of this little stable state. So the stability that we've enjoyed over the course of human civilization is about to change. Again, human beings have dealt with this before. We know that human beings can survive in periods where climate changes quite dramatically, but none of the techniques that we have, none of the strategies or tools that we have for managing large human populations, the tools we've developed over the last 12,000 years for managing large populations, none of those are really equipped to deal with the radically fluctuating temperatures, the radically fluctuating climate that we're about to experience over the next few generations. So this isn't just a story about modern industry. This is really the story of human history, and we had this sort of momentary period of relative calm, relative stability, and we ruined it by burning fossil fuels. Right. So all the fossil fuels that we've been burning are deep underground reservoirs of oil that are the result of millions of years of biological activity. As I said, plants turn the sunlight into their bodies. And so you can think of plants' bodies, the organic material in plant matter, you can think of that as stored sunlight. Like it took energy from the sun to create those plants. And in the early Earth, a lot of these plants the plants grew before there was a lot of things to decompose that organic matter and put it back into the carbon cycle. So a lot of this organic matter ended up getting covered in mud and buried way underground and turning into oil and coal. And all that oil and coal is really just stored sunlight. It's really just energy that plants have sequestered in their bodies and put underground. And so when we burn that coal and we burn that oil, what we're doing is we're taking millions of years of stored sunlight, hundreds of millions of years of stored sunlight, hundreds of millions of years of energy that was stored in plants capturing sunlight. And we released all of that hundreds of millions of years of carbon into the atmosphere in the course of a couple of hundred years. Just a couple of decades, really. And so this is it has a dramatic impact on the course of geological history. We're out of this little stable period, and we got to figure out something to do about it. And this is where the geoengineering discussion comes in. So geoengineering, again, I get most of the information from this part of the essay, or this part of the lesson, from my friend John Lawhead, who gave this lecture a couple of years ago at USC. So we've known about climate change for a couple of decades now. We've known that it's going to get bad soon, and scientists have been urging politicians to do something about climate change for decades, since at least the 70s. The standard recommendation that scientists have urged is usually described as a mitigation strategy. Mitigation is to stop the bad things from happening. So if the bad thing that's happening is that we're putting carbon in the atmosphere, then the mitigation strategy is to stop putting carbon in the atmosphere, get people to stop burning fossil fuels, get people to lower their carbon emissions, get people to be more thoughtful about their environmental impact. So mitigation strategies are usually attempts to change human behavior, stop doing that thing. And this is the gold standard in policy. This is how policy usually goes. The last few decades of recommendations have been mitigation strategies. So things like, you might be familiar with things like the carbon tax. Carbon taxes, where you're taxing businesses on the basis of their climate emissions. And cap and trade is where you not only tax people for their carbon emissions, but you also give people credit for emitting less than some threshold. And they can use those credits, they can sell those credits to other companies. So if some companies emitting more carbon than they should, but some other companies emitting less carbon than they should, then the company that's emitting less carbon can sell their credits to the company emitting more carbon, in order to sort of balance out how much carbon is being emitted. And so the idea is to put a threshold on the overall carbon emission, and then tax people if they're emitting too much carbon in order to get that overall threshold under control. These are changes to human behavior, usually financial incentives to get people to change their behavior. Another kind of mitigation strategy that you're probably very familiar with are alternative energy policies, wind and solar policies to try to get us off fossil fuels. Again, this is a way of changing human behavior to stop doing the bad thing. So mitigation strategies have been recommended for decades, but they have not been very effective. People aren't adopting these policies at the rate that we need to in order to stop climate change from happening. So in addition to mitigation strategies, what has become more popular recently are adaptation strategies. Adaptation strategies tend to admit that the climate change is happening, and instead of trying to stop that climate change from happening, instead the adaptation strategies try to do things in order to stop the worst impact of that climate change. Right. So if, for instance, if climate change is going to result in sea levels rising, then one adaptation strategy is to move people away from the coasts. If their house is going to go underwater in the next 100 years, then it'll be cheaper to move them away from the coast now than it will be to move them, when their house starts flooding. So this is an adaptation strategy. Moving people away from the coast is not going to stop climate change from happening. It's not going to reduce the impact of climate change, but it might reduce the cost on human well-being. Right? It might be easier to do it now if we try to adapt early. So things like levee construction, changes in land use, moving people away from places that are going to be most severely impacted by climate change. These are adaptation strategies. Mitigation strategies tends to be the thing that scientists recommend to stop doing the bad thing. Adaptation strategies tend to be recommended by more conservative people, and especially given an economic motivation. Adaptation strategies are usually defended by being the cheaper alternative. The idea is that you're not going to convince the companies from emitting carbon. They're going to emit the carbon anyway. Things are just going to get bad. And instead of continuing to beg them to stop emitting carbon, we should just do something about ourselves, make sure we're prepared for the worst of climate change. But both of these strategies don't seem very promising. They don't seem like they've been working very well. And so this is where the third strategy enters, which is geoengineering. So by geoengineering, I mean, this is again from John Lawhead, geoengineering here means direct interventions on geosystems, on global scale systems. So geoengineering is not just changing local weather patterns. Sometimes you see these stories about seeding clouds in order to cause rain clouds nearby. So that kind of local weather manipulation is not geoengineering because it's not really global in scale. Remember, there's a difference between weather and climate. And it's precisely this difference in scale. The weather involves local, either regionally local, geographically local, or temporally local. That it's raining today and it's not raining tomorrow. That's a temperature difference, but it's not really a difference in climate. The difference in climate is something on a global scale and on sort of long-term scale. So not just what happens today or tomorrow, but what happens over the next 10 years. So geoengineering is engineering projects aimed at intervening on global scale systems, on whole planetary systems, and have timescales on the order of years. And the idea is to somehow counter the impact of climate change, either the problem directly, which is the carbon in the atmosphere, or some related problem like surface reflectivity or sort of greenhouse gases. How much light from the sun we're getting, how much energy from the sun we're getting. So I want to talk in this discussion of geoengineering about a couple of different approaches. One approach is about managing the energy from the sun, solar radiation management. The other is about actually taking the carbon out of the atmosphere or doing something with the carbon. So if we're talking about reflectivity, so one commonly discussed issue, and we saw this earlier in that Bloomberg infographic, is about surface albedo. So the amount of reflectivity on the surface, how reflective the surface is, how bright the surface is. This is called the albedo. And you might think of a sort of an albedo budget as how much light are we receiving and how much light are we reflecting. And so this is the chart that gives you a sense of the overall energy flow in terms of solar radiation. So there's 341 watts per meter squared of energy from the sun. 341, 78 of that watts per meter squared is absorbed by the atmosphere. 79 watts per meter squared is reflected off the clouds in the atmosphere and shot back off into space. And then a lot of it, 161 watts per meter squared, is actually absorbed by the surface of the Earth, and this partly results in a higher temperature. Some of that, actually very small, is reflected off the surface. So much more of it is either absorbed by the atmosphere or reflected off the clouds in the atmosphere. So this is the energy coming in from outside, but there's also energy coming off from the surface. So a lot is getting absorbed by the surface, but there's also a bunch of radiation coming off the surface. Again, in watts per meter squared, 374 coming off. Some of that is getting blocked by the clouds and gets blocked back down. This is the sort of greenhouse gas effect, where energy that's being radiated off the surface comes back down off the clouds. And it's this greenhouse gas that most strongly contributes to the rising temperatures that we're dealing with. So this is the radiation budget. And if we want to if we want to manipulate solar radiation on a global scale with the geoengineering project, this is the system that we're going to be tweaking in various ways. So there's lots of different proposals for how to do this. One proposal, actually, let me go back here. One proposal is just to make the surface brighter. So there are some policies, for instance, in France and some other countries, that there are laws that the roof of buildings and houses have to be painted white. If you have a big commercial plant or a warehouse or something, the roof has to be painted white, because if it's white, that's more reflective, and so it's going to absorb less heat from the sun. It's going to reflect more heat. This is going to change the overall reflectivity of the surface. How much does that actually matter? Well, let me see. Let me go back here. So albedo is measured. So albedo is measured in a unit that's a dimensionless unit. So there's no units after this. Albedo is 0.04, but it's about the reflectivity, and 1 is going to be perfectly reflective surfaces. So it's very hard. Like a mirror is going to be a perfectly reflective surface. Maybe fresh snow, very white surfaces are going to have very high albedo. Things like sand is going to have an albedo of 4. Concrete is pretty bright, has an albedo of 0.55. The ocean has an albedo of 0.06. So the ocean is not very bright. It's not very reflective. Asphalt has an albedo of 0.04. So asphalt is very dark, and asphalt absorbs a lot of the energy. It's coming from the sun and radiation. Okay, so we're absorbing a lot of energy, and the different things change how reflective this stuff is. Some of the research that I have for you on albedo suggests that if we change the overall reflectivity of the surface by about 4 watts per square meter, we could offset twice as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So offsetting by just a couple of watts, by 4 watts. So in other words, increasing the surface albedo by about 0.02. So from 0.15 to 0.17. Surface albedo right now is 0.15, so just slightly darker than bare soil. Maybe this is partly because a lot of it's ocean. Oh no, the surface albedo is maybe not the ocean part of it. But the lesson here is that if we increase surface albedo by 0.02, we can move it from 0.15 to 0.17, and that would offset a doubling of CO2. So we could double CO2 without the comparable change in temperature if we increase the surface radiation by 0.02. Oh yeah, and then if we ignore the ocean, then if we just increase the surface albedo on land by 0.08, we can get the same impact. So how do we increase the surface albedo? Well, we can do things like paint the roofs white. That's going to have a very small impact, but maybe the bigger one is something like pavements. Pavements account for about 40% of all urban surfaces. And if we just increase the surface albedo of roofs and pavements by 0.25 and 0.1 respectively, this is the equivalent of reducing carbon emissions by something like 40 to 70 gigatons. It's worth $1 trillion to the economy. So developing a more reflective, a less radiation absorbent pavement asphalt. If you can make asphalt that's brighter, but that doesn't cause glare, that doesn't have other negative consequences. But if the pavement is brighter, if the asphalt is brighter, then maybe it doesn't absorb as much energy, and maybe it reflects more of it away. We know that the amount of pavement that we already have has a significant impact on temperature, especially locally. This is why it's always warmer in a city than it is in the country around it. It's warmer in the city because the city absorbs a lot of the heat from the day and then stores it in the concrete and pavement and all the roads and so on. And that roads keep the city warmer than the surrounding environment. So it's definitely the case that we can build enough stuff to change the surface temperature on the planet, and we do this with all of our cities. And if we put down a lot of roads, those roads cover a fraction of the Earth's surface that is not insignificant in terms of surface albedo. If those roads were slightly lighter, slightly brighter, slightly more reflective, then this might have an impact on the overall surface albedo. Very small impact. Other kinds of suggestions along these lines, though, are things like maybe covering the Sahara Desert in mirrors. You just put a bunch of mirrors in the Sahara Desert, pointed up, and reflecting off a lot of light. Maybe that can change the surface reflectivity of the Earth. One of the problems with putting up a lot of mirrors is that they would be very expensive to install. A few square miles of mirror on the desert. It'd be very expensive. We also just don't know what the ecological impact would be on the animals that live in the desert, on the atmosphere right above the desert, where those mirrors are. And one of the big things is because it would be very expensive to set up, and if it doesn't work the way we expected it to, it would also be very expensive to tear down. And building these big projects that are not fully tested and then having them fail is sort of a worry, especially a worry since we don't have a lot of time to be testing these kinds of things. So the idea of big surface albedo projects is it's not entirely attractive. It's maybe more expensive. Maybe there are better ways of approaching the geoengineering projects. Here's another geoengineering project, and maybe this is the most commonly associated with geoengineering projects. These are the stratospheric aerosol injections. So stratospheric is just high in the atmosphere, one of the high layers in the atmosphere. And these aerosols, like I said, are these little micrometer-sized droplets. And so if you go up way into the stratosphere and release a bunch of aerosols, the idea is that the aerosols will eventually will help block out the sunlight and reduce the amount of sunlight that's hitting the surface, and so help control temperatures. You have to get those aerosols way up in the upper stratosphere, so it can't be down low where the clouds are, but it has to be up even higher in order to avoid the greenhouse gas interactions. And so because it has to be so high, the plans usually involve like these big helium balloons that they raise very high and they release a bunch of stuff. The amount of material that you'd have to release in order to create a cloud big enough to block out the sunlight, you have to use a lot of material. The clouds have to be really big. Typically, they're using some sulfur compound, either hydrogen sulfide or sulfur dioxide, some sulfur chemical, and the estimates are something like 5 to 7 teragrams of this sulfur compound per year. And that's per year, with the idea being that you might have to go back up regularly, fairly often, in order to replenish the amount of sulfur in the stratosphere, because of course, that sulfur will eventually fall out of the stratosphere, and when it does fall out of the stratosphere, it falls as acid rain. So one of the drawbacks of this this process is that you end up creating these toxic conditions on Earth. You create acid rain, which might hurt human and other biological populations on the surface. The goal here is just to block out the sunlight, but it doesn't create perfect environmental conditions just because you're blocking out the sunlight. Acid rain is pretty hard. You also get things like droughts. You get changes to the water cycle. These things are bad. They're bad, but maybe they're not as bad as the worst impact of climate change. And what you're going to see as things start getting worse, as things start getting more dire, as the political situation starts getting more desperate, is that these kinds of policies, while they don't look good now, they will start to look more and more attractive, and especially to politicians who want to take a risk, maybe a scientific risk, in order to do something that has popular appeal. Like, you can imagine a lot of people who have crops failing and aren't able to eat, and there's a lot of famine, and maybe someone proposes a stratospheric aerosol injection policy that gets a big crowd of support because they have no other options because their crops are failing. So maybe someone who's pushing this can make it seem more attractive than it actually is, especially as things get more desperate. It's likely that the negative consequences also get downplayed, the impact in terms of acid rain and in terms of droughts and so on. But one reason why this possibility gets talked about so often is because we do have some natural... So this is maybe one of the most well-studied geoengineering proposals. There's lots of scientific models that look at what happens when you inject aerosols in the upper atmosphere into the stratosphere. And the models suggest it would be effective. And one of the reasons why we have confidence in these models is because we also have natural models. These aren't just computer simulations. But in fact, when certain kinds of volcanoes erupt, they end up releasing a bunch of sulfur compounds into the stratosphere. And so you can tell what will happen as a result of this kind of activity from just looking at what happens in nature. Because we have these natural models to look at, we can be fairly confident in what the impact will be. So this is Mount Pinatubo. Mount Pinatubo is one of these sulfur-rich volcanoes that exploded in 1991. I have a video up here if you want to watch Mount Pinatubo explode. This is a fairly recent volcano explosion, and it's about the size and content of material that we would release ourselves in one of these stratospheric aerosol injections. So if we just look at what happened after Mount Pinatubo, we can have a pretty good idea of what the impact of one of these stratospheric aerosol injections would be. And what you see after Mount Pinatubo is exactly as I described. You see droughts, you see huge drops in freshwater precipitation in the water cycle. And importantly, these droughts are not uniform across the planet, but they tend to be concentrated in equatorial regions. So this is the drought severity index. This is a map of where the worst droughts were in 1991, just after Mount Pinatubo. And you can see here in the equatorial regions, you have really, really bad droughts. This is because Mount Pinatubo is an equatorial volcano, and releasing all of that sulfur around the equator ends up causing droughts all around the equator. If we were to do our own stratospheric aerosol injection, we would probably also do it around the equator, because that's where you're going to have the most impact from direct sunlight. So it's very likely that if we were to do one of these stratospheric aerosol injection on a large scale, it would also likely have a big impact on equatorial communities and their water supply. Now, we know from other reasons that the water supply is not in very great shape, and there's going to be a lot of political and economic tensions over access to water. And this kind of activity is likely to just make that worse. It's also worth mentioning here, we saw earlier where a lot of the carbon is coming from in the atmosphere, and a lot of that carbon is coming from like India and Japan and China and the United States, maybe Europe, but that's really not where the droughts are concentrated. Droughts are concentrated in these equatorial countries, which tend to be not the most wealthy countries. They tend to be not the ones that are responsible for most of the carbon emissions that we see. So this is part of the political challenge here, is that the countries that are responsible for the carbon emissions are not the countries that will face the impact of our attempts to deal with those carbon emissions. And again, we just don't have any political structure infrastructure for making these kinds of decisions. How do you make an agreement with these countries in these equatorial regions to allow us to subject them to droughts and acid rain in the future in order to stabilize the climate for these northern countries who were responsible for the climate disasters in the first place? Like, how do you negotiate? There's no decision-making procedure that we have for dealing with these kinds of global decisions. The decision infrastructure that we have now is mostly each country deciding what happens within its own borders. But the global climate doesn't care about borders. Carbon in the atmosphere doesn't care where you draw the line between different countries. And so the very infrastructure that we have for making these decisions is just not suited to the scope and scale of the decisions we have to make. Again, the frameworks that we have are largely agricultural industrial age technologies that assumed certain things about how the world works, especially assumes something about the stability of the climate. And when those assumptions go out the window, we just need new governing frameworks. We need new political assumptions about how to manage global populations. And we don't have that now, and we really need it because we really need to be acting as a global community. Atmospheric aerosol injections, they're popular among scientists because they're easy to study. We have a lot of data to study them. And they're just getting more and more popular. Recently, just last year, there were a couple of proposals for actually conducting research on sort of small-scale aerosol injections. So not doing the whole 5 to 7 teragrams, but doing a smaller aerosol injection in order to study the impact, in order to maybe prepare for future aerosol injections later on. So they're relatively cheap in terms, all things considered. They're relatively effective. We know that those aerosols will block out the sun. The problem is that they're temporary, and so we might need to keep doing it. Sometimes people criticize these stratospheric aerosol injections for being habit-forming because, you inject the aerosol and then it falls out as acid rain, and then you got to go inject more. The idea here is that maybe these stratospheric aerosol injections can buy us a couple of years. Like if climate starts getting really bad and we need temperatures to cool down in order to get food, maybe we put some clouds in the sky in order to keep the temperatures lower so we can grow the food and extend our working capacity for a couple of years until we get better solutions. But the idea is that if those better solutions don't come and then we just keep doing this injection cycle, eventually this is going to have catastrophic environmental impact. Another really complicated thing about stratospheric aerosol injections is the capacity for unilateral action. It's not the kind. So although climate change is something that's going to require global cooperation, performing stratosphere and aerosol injection doesn't require global cooperation. It just requires someone with enough money and the interest to do it. So like Facebook has been experimenting with high atmosphere balloons to do things like broadcast Wi-Fi signals and so on. So they have a bunch of these balloons that are able to inject stratospheric aerosols. Maybe Facebook, maybe Mark Zuckerberg decides that climate change is too scary and he needs to take action on his own. And despite there being no action from the government, maybe Mark Zuckerberg decides to take a bunch of sulfur and just create his own cloud. Maybe that ends up being illegal. Maybe it's a bad idea. Maybe it's a good idea and gets people moving. The issue is that people can do it on their own without community consensus, without the consensus of the scientific community, without consensus of the global community. And so you have situations where individuals or corporations can take climate-changing actions unilaterally on their own accord by their own decisions. And that's also really scary. Again, it'll be more and more disturbing, more and more risky as the effects of climate change themselves become more dramatic and these risky options start to look more attractive. There are, of course, lots of movies where they depict human attempts to block out the sun for various reasons. This is also what happens in The Matrix. And in the movies, it never looks like a good idea. But this is the thing that people talk. This is the thing that people actually talk about. Scientists actually talk about, and there are plans in place to actually test some of these theories. So you should not be surprised to see more attempts to do these stratospheric aerosol injections in the future. I mean, you might think in your essay this week about whether this is a good idea. Albedo management and aerosol injections are both ways of managing solar radiation, about managing how much sun is absorbed by the Earth's surface. But the big problem is not solar radiation; it's really the greenhouse gases that keep that solar radiation trapped in the on the surface. And so, if we really want to attack the source, we really need to stop introducing carbon to the atmosphere, and we need to learn how to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So instead of looking at just the solar radiation chart, this is the carbon cycle chart. So this is the complete flow of carbon around the surface. So each one of these numbers is in gigatons of carbon, or if it's an arrow, it's in gigatons of carbon per year. So the arrows discuss the flow between different reservoirs of carbon. So for instance, there's 150 gigatons of carbon in the surface sediment at the bottom ocean, and there's 37,000 gigatons of carbon locked up in the intermediate and deep ocean. This is by far the largest store of ocean on the surface is in the deep ocean. It's just sort of locked up in the deep ocean. So out of that deep ocean, you see that there's a flow with the surface. So about 90 gigatons of carbon flows out of the surface into the deep ocean, and about 101 gigatons of carbon flows out of the deep ocean into the surface. So there's like a little cycle. And notice that the cycle is mostly the deep ocean kicking carbon up into the surface. So 90 float back down to the deep ocean, but 101 gigatons of carbon float up from the deep ocean into the surface. So the overall cycle is pointed towards the surface. And the red numbers here are human impact on the forcing. So the natural process here is 90 gigatons down and 101 gigatons up, and then the human activity leads to another 1.6 gigatons going from the surface ocean down to the deep ocean, and adding an overall extra 100 gigatons of carbon to that deep ocean. So you see here the cycle from lots of things. Fossil fuels are being released into the atmosphere as a result of industrial activity. There's no natural analog of this process, so this is all carbon that's introduced to the atmosphere apart from human activity. Notice that the carbon released to the atmosphere as part of human activity is relatively small compared to the entire carbon cycle. Like just the carbon exchanged from the surface ocean to the atmosphere is an order of magnitude more. Right, so just the natural process here is that 70.6 gigatons of carbon is released from the surface into the atmosphere, and 70 gigatons of carbon is absorbed back into the surface from the atmosphere. So this little cycle, 70 gigatons of carbon moving around between the atmosphere and the surface, is really big compared to the 6 gigatons of carbon that human beings are adding. But the really important point is that the human addition to these cycles is changing the overall flow of carbon in this process. And you can see that by comparing the natural flow of carbon with the human addition between the surface and ocean and the atmosphere. So the natural flow, again, is 70.6 up and 70 down. So the overall flow is slightly towards putting more carbon in the atmosphere. But with human activity, we add an additional 22.2 carbon going from the atmosphere to the surface, and an additional 20 gigatons of carbon going from the surface to the atmosphere. So notice that the overall flow for the natural process is slightly towards the atmosphere. And while the human forcing here is relatively small, the result is that more carbon is absorbed in the surface ocean than the atmosphere. So slightly 0.6 more from the ocean to the atmosphere in the natural process, but 2.2 more from the atmosphere to the ocean in the human addition. And that means that the overall exchange, because of human activity from the atmosphere to the ocean, is slightly more towards the ocean. If the humans weren't around, you'd have the exchange being slightly more you'd have the exchange being slightly more towards the atmosphere, but because the human additions, the ocean is absorbing more than it's releasing to the atmosphere. And what this results in is something called ocean acidification. Carbon, like in your carbonated soda, it gets fizzy and it gets the carbonation is kind of acid. And so the more carbon that's trapped in the surface ocean makes the surface ocean more acidic, and that ends up being very devastating to the wildlife in the surface ocean. Fish and other marine life don't do well with small changes in acidity, and you have things like ocean fish stock collapsing as a result of these changes to the carbon cycle. So you also have from surface vegetation into the atmosphere changes here. So this is the carbon cycle. If we're going to be changing atmospheric carbon, then this is the cycle that we're going to be tweaking, that we're going to be manipulating in various ways. I've talked about ocean acidification, how much carbon is being trapped up in the ocean, but there's plant life photosynthesizing in the surface ocean also, this phytoplankton, and they breathe the carbon dioxide, and so they take up carbon dioxide just like other photosynthesizing plants do. And so so one idea is that if we fertilize the ocean in order to stimulate the growth of these phytoplankton or make more sort of these algae blooms or these blooms of phytoplankton, then maybe the phytoplankton can sequester more carbon into their body, and that brings down not just the ocean acidification, but it also helps the ocean absorb more carbon from the atmosphere, and this brings down atmospheric carbon as well. One reason that this looks very promising is because the molecular biological analysis on the surface ocean suggests that the big constraint on growth for these animals is iron. That the essential biological nutrient that these creatures lack is iron. And so the idea of ocean fertilization is you just dump a bunch of iron in the ocean. If there's more iron, then that constraint is lifted and maybe more plankton grow. So you put a bunch of iron in the ocean and then hope the plankton grow. And the nice thing about that is that the ratio between iron molecules and carbon molecules that are sequestered is really promising. So 0.001 molecules of iron, or sorry, 0.001 atoms of iron will sequester something like 106 atoms of carbon. So the promise here is that relatively little iron will result in relatively large carbon sequestration. So that's the idea in theory, but we don't really know in practice. This stuff hasn't been well tested. First of all, we don't know that adding iron will result in phytoplankton blooms that sequester significantly more carbon. It's possible we just dump a bunch of iron in the ocean, that iron just falls to the ocean floor and doesn't do anything at all to the carbon cycle. It's also possible that these phytoplankton blooms have all sorts of other disrupting effects on the ecosystem in the ocean. We really don't know what that impact will be, and so there's not a lot of pressure to try to do this kind of thing because there's so many sort of unknowns in the proposal. Nevertheless, that hasn't stopped some people from trying, and there have been a couple of people who John talks about this in his talk, people who have tried to go out to the ocean and fertilize the surface with iron to see if it actually grows. This stuff is sometimes done outside of regulations. People who have tried to do this on their own have usually been fined or arrested because it's not legal to be dumping iron into the ocean in order to run this kind of experiment. So it sounds good on paper. Whether it actually works in practice is a big question. What the other kinds of environmental consequences of this kind of practice is also a big question. Maybe one of the most promising and safest techniques for dealing with atmospheric carbon is called carbon sequestration. There's a couple of different forms of carbon sequestration: chemical carbon sequestration, biocarbon sequestration. But the idea here is just some process, either a chemical process or biological process, that pulls carbon directly out of the atmosphere and then sequesters it, so takes it out of the carbon cycle. So chemical carbon sequestration, see if I can show this to you in this video. Chemical carbon sequestration, it's a chemical process where you take atmospheric carbon and you pump it underground into rocks that have a lot of pores in the rocks. Let me see if I can actually show you the... Yeah, here we go. So you pump it underground into this porous volcanic rock, and the porous volcanic rock will accept and absorb a lot of this carbon, and then fix it to the to the rock structure. In other words, you're basically turning the carbon into a rock. You're not turning it into coal that you can use for power. What you're doing is you're just turning it into a solid, a rock. So here she's showing you these cores of an experiment being done. I think this is in Iceland. It's somewhere in Northern Europe. where it's just a couple of years after pumping this carbon gases into the ground with their chemical process, and then under the pressure, it turns into these carbon rods. These carbon rods are not organic anymore, so they're out of the carbon cycle. So nothing's going to eat this carbon and then put it back into the carbon cycle. So it's not going back in the atmosphere. This is now rock in the ground. And it doesn't take that long to do. It's only a couple of years. Coal and oil underground takes millions of years in order to turn into coal and oil. But these rocks only take a couple of years of injecting the CO2 underground. The issue with this carbon sequestration is just that it's really energy expensive. You need a lot of power in order to pump the carbon underground. And if you're just burning fossil fuels to run the chemical sequestration, maybe you're producing more carbon than you're actually saving. So this only works on the assumption that you have a clean abundant source of energy. And in Northern Europe, they have things like geothermal energy and hydroelectric energy that is cheap and abundant, and it's not. It's also clean energy, so they can use it to run these very energy expensive processes like carbon sequestration. So that's okay. Running it off of geothermal energy, there's plenty of geothermal energy. There's plenty of other sources of clean energy that we might use in order to do this carbon sequestration. But that energy isn't ubiquitous, so not every place has abundant geothermal energy. Some places do. Iceland does. Places in Northern Europe do. But that means that we have to transport the carbon to these locations. And again, if you're just burning fossil fuels in order to do that transportation, maybe you're not saving overall on the amount of carbon that you're doing. So this is it's a limited and maybe a special purpose technology. If this stuff gets better, if this kind of carbon sequestration activity gets better, then maybe it can work at a scale where it's actually impacting the global climate. It doesn't address all of the issues that we're facing. It doesn't address things like ocean acidification. It doesn't. It's not a total solution, but it is promising. It is a clean source of response to climate change that might be a geoengineering response that's actually viable. Along with chemical carbon sequestration is different forms of biological or bioenergy carbon sequestration. This is, instead of using a chemical to turn the carbon into rocks, you use fields to grow plants that sequester the carbon very quickly. So you use some fast-growing plant. Switchgrass is usually used. Eucalyptus is also a fast-growing plant. That very quickly turns a lot of carbon into a big tree or a lot of grass. And the idea is that you have a farm that builds these very rapidly growing biological material, and then you cut all that biological material down, and you bury it. You turn it into charcoal, you burn it, and then you bury it. Some of that charcoal will result in carbon going back into the atmosphere, but that's carbon you just pulled out in those plants. The rest of the coal goes underground as rocks, again, that are out of the carbon cycle. In order to do so, it's sort of slow. Trees don't grow terribly quickly. Even if you grow very quickly growing trees, it still takes time to grow them all, and then chop them down and then regrow them. So it's slow. It's also resource intensive. It's intensive in terms of land. It's also intensive in terms of water. Especially if there's a lot of droughts and water crises in the future, if water becomes very if it becomes very difficult to obtain water in large quantities, then maybe we don't want to use that water on plants that we're just going to bury underground. Maybe we want to use that water to grow plants that we're going to eat or to drink for ourselves. You need to do this with quite a lot of material. You need to grow something like you need to grow enough switchgrass that would require something like the Lake of Michigan to water in order to offset the carbon increases that we're seeing right now. So again, this looks like a limited solution. It has maybe its role to play, but it's only part of the story. I've given you lots of different geoengineering techniques here, and this last little chart is a way of comparing them all. So this chart rates the different techniques on their effectiveness. How effective are they at stopping temperature change, stopping climate change? And then how affordable are they? How the very affordable ones are cheap and the low affordability ones are expensive. So we said earlier that changing the surface albedo in the desert by like building a bunch of mirrors in the desert, that's going to be very expensive and it's maybe only slightly effective. Changing the surface albedo of the urban landscape, like making pavement brighter. This is also not very cheap. It's very expensive and maybe even less effective than building a bunch of mirrors in space. Over here at the high affordability, high effectiveness, you see the stratospheric aerosol injections. So another part of this graph is that you also see the difference between red, yellow, and green. So the green is safe techniques and the red is unsafe techniques. So changing the surface albedo is going to be relatively safe. Maybe changing the surface albedo of the desert is not so safe to the environment and so on. Stratospheric aerosol injections. Notice stratospheric aerosol injections are fairly affordable and they're also fairly effective, but they're also very dangerous. And that's worrying. What's worrying is not just how dangerous it is, because there's other maybe more dangerous techniques, but it's dangerous while also being affordable and effective, which means that people might do it despite the dangers. And here's also sort of in the middle, the sort of all-around good solution is the carbon sequestration and bioenergy sequestration of trying to pull the carbon out of the atmosphere. These are sort of the middle techniques. So these are a comparison of different geoengineering techniques. You might think about whether these techniques are warranted. What would be required in order to make these techniques viable or attractive? How do we prevent politicians from instituting some of these more dangerous or wrong-headed policies? How likely is it that you think that you're going to see these kinds of geoengineering techniques in the future? I'm really interested to see what you say about all of this stuff. Thank you for listening to this lecture. I know it's long. I had a lot to say, but I hope you found some of this interesting. I'm excited to hear what you say. Good luck with your essay in the future.